Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this final event in our Geography Awareness Week series. Today, we are going to be talking about open source geospatial data and tools with a panel of participants ranging across the geospatial sphere. This panel, as I mentioned, is the last event in the series of Geography Awareness Week events we've had this week. So here's the list. All of these sessions were recorded and they'll be posted on the Data Services YouTube page in case you're interested in watching them after the fact. If you have any questions about any of the topics, feel free to reach out to me or any of the Data Services team members. You can get to us through our webpage, library.wustl.edu/data. Then there you can check out information about the core services that we offer to the WashU community, our help desk, which happens 4 days a week for your data-related questions, and also our contact information. I also just wanted to mention a new group on campus, the Washington University Geospatial Working Group, which was formed in March of 2021. So just this past spring. And it's an informal collection of faculty and staff from across the university, every school, building university capacity in geospatial science. The group's goals are to create an intellectual hub for synergizing geospatial activities, to enhance geospatial research infrastructure, to advance teaching and workforce development in the geospatial arena, and to deepen partnerships with geospatial institutions in St. Louis and the national geospatial industry, including government. If you are interested in participating, you can reach out to my colleague, Bill Winston, contact information available on our website, and he'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about this emerging group. So I'm going to do a quick intro of our panelists, and then I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves and give us a little bit more information about what they've been working on. Dr. Seth Graebner is an associate professor of French and Global Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. Aisha Al-Mohammadi is undergraduate student in Arts and Sciences at WashU as well. So our home team. Then we have Tom Vaught, Senior Geographic Information Systems Specialist at the University of Missouri and Data Manager at the Missouri Spatial Data Information Service, or MSDIS. And then we have Jim Bednar, Director of Technical Consulting at Anaconda, Inc. So I guess I'll start with the visitors here and let Jim get started with a little introduction. And I'll stop sharing my screen, Jim, if you would like to hop on.
And what's the time limit?
You want to do about 10 minutes or so?
Sounds good.
Great.
I could talk for days, so just stop me.
Okay.
My employer is Anaconda, but I have a lot of hats. And one of my hats is I run this organization called piviz.org. And this is a collection of open source tools for doing visualization in Python. So Python, as many people know, is now the most popular language ever. It is the language, the default language now, and it's used widely throughout geosciences. And one of the great things about Python is that there's tons of stuff available, and one of the bad things is that there's tons of stuff available, and this page represents that. This is a list of plotting libraries for Python. It just goes on, and it's really hard to figure out what to do, including a bunch of things that aren't even really used anymore. And so piviz.org is a great place. You've heard of a library, try to learn about what that is and see how it compares. What else is in the same category as this library? And this is a really useful thing, this built-on field. If you find some random library that says, hey, you should use this, you can look over and see what it's built on, and then you understand a lot about it. The core libraries, Python really only has 3 core libraries, and everything else is, there's so many, not everything else, lots of other things are built on them. So this page will help you figure things out. So that's just a useful thing. completely generic and we're not pushing it. It doesn't push any particular library. So just that's good to know. Then I also run a very opinionated group, which is called HoloViz. And on the HoloViz pages, we will say, use this tool. This is the best tool. Those other tools are no good. And that's because these are the tools we build and we know exactly what they're good for. So we're going to strongly argue for these. And so presenting all of these libraries, only one of which is geo-specific, but all of which are used by our geoscientist colleagues. Anaconda doesn't have any stake in geoscience. It's just about data processing in general. But we have one very specific library for geoscience, and we try to make everything else not need this library. But when you need a projection, you need to put something on the surface of the Earth, then you use GeoViews. Otherwise, you can use all the other ones. And the thing is that they work very well together, because sometimes you need a plot with a map right next to a plot that doesn't have a map. And they're all important, and there's no reason to have an artificial boundary. So we have one that is very specific to GeoViews. This one pulls in a lot from the Python open source geoscience stack, like GAW and things like that. The rest of them do not. And so this is our general approach. And if you want to learn about what we're up to, that's at holoviz.org, or GeoViews if you want the geo-specific stuff. And also probably a great way to learn about it is to go to this generic site called examples.pybiz.org. And there you'll notice that a lot of the examples, they have really tiny icons for no good reason, but a lot of them are geo examples, even when they're non-geo tools. And that's just because it's super easy for people to understand geo topics. But this is a great way to see some of the power that's available in Python open source for doing geoscience. And I just pulled up one of the examples here. This is a particular thing that we've done that plots ship traffic. This is showing locations, GPS coordinates for about, I can't remember, something like 50 million data points. It's run by a Python Jupyter notebook, a few hundred lines of code, and it's showing color code for what's going on. And if you zoom in, this is all stuff that is based on JavaScript because it's happening in your browser, but it's calling out to Python. Python is going to be rendering something. It's running in the background. It just updated it, sent it back to the browser. And that's a common thing about Python OSS tools for geoscience is that they're in Python, but they're exposed in JavaScript in your browser. And so you can just keep zooming in. It keeps making a call out to Python, updating what you see, and then letting you interact with it. And so in this case, we just zoomed in enough that we're going to see individual ships sitting around. You can actually see the photograph of the ship. And then this is all the locations as they drift with the currents or whatever it is. I'm not a geoscientist. I'm just plotting the data, and there it is. So another thing that split off of our group, Brendan Collins started his own company called MakePath, and it is GIS focused. He took this library outside of our group and now maintains it as a separate one. This is a library for raster-based processing of geoscience data. And so things like computing NDVI, if you're working with satellite imagery, computing viewshed, try to figure out where you see, library to see what's the closest Amazon data center to every point on the map. Things like that will be done by this. And this is a full, purely open source, high performance, scalable solutions. So that's true for my group and for MakePath. We work on things that are super fast in Python, distributable, open source. So that's what I'm here to represent. That's what I argued, that these tools ought to be general purpose, specific to geoscience only when absolutely necessary, and built on a high performance platform. And then those principles are shared with our collaborators at Pangeo. And I can speak for them as well if anyone has any questions. Pangeo is literally about geoscience in Python for big data, and they scale up to everything. And we write tools here at Anaconda to help. So that's my big pitch.
Awesome. Thanks for that, Jim. Definitely looking forward to talking more about that in a little bit. Okay, so next, let's go to our other visitor, Tom, to give us a little intro to what he does at MSDIS.
I don't have anything nearly as cool to follow that with, so that's not fair. Those of you who have used GIS in Missouri in the last several years, hopefully are already familiar with MSDIS and with what we do. And again, if you've heard my spiel before, it's important, I suppose, to point out that when I say we, it's just me. It's the royal we, or the slightly off we. Our job is to collect data, GIS data, that are funded by state agencies, federal agencies, even local government agencies. Basically, any data that are created on the taxpayer's dime, and make those freely available to the general public. We are sort of I say we're a professional middleman, but we're sort of a solution to the Sunshine Law as far as the state of Missouri is concerned. They provide us their latest and greatest geospatial data. We make it available to the public, and that way they can, anybody who needs it just comes to us. They don't have to request anything. They don't have to make any special sort of trips anywhere. They've got us to provide that for. To that effort, we have terabytes upon terabytes upon terabytes of vector data, high resolution imagery and LiDAR, and a special super duper huge thanks to Molly and the crew at WashU for helping distribute that and store that and make sure that is available. I absolutely could not do it without you guys. Previously, MSDIS took the form of just an old-fashioned FTP. We then graduated to a couple of ESRI servers. Now we have sort of morphed into a ESRI open data hub page, which allows users to view the latest versions of the data that are produced by the state, and they can preview those before they download them, clip out just what they need. So you don't have to download the whole MoDOT roads network. You can just download the bits you need, and put those to use any way they need to. We also still do maintain our file archive of older data. So anything that MSDIS has been provided in the past, in theory, that should be stashed away someplace. I am a real life pack rat, and I'm also a digital pack rat. So I don't like throwing things away at all. In addition to just storing data and making sure that those data are available for anybody who is interested in using them, and it's not about need. We are here for people who need the data. We are here for people who are just curious. If you want to see what your house looked like in the latest version of NAEP, and the version of NAEP 2 years ago and 2 years before that, come on over. I am happy for you to connect to our services and compare and contrast. We are not here just for the geospatial community. And in fact, as open source tools become more and more popular, and they are becoming more and more popular, much more common, I am getting a lot more inquiries from what I refer to as the GIS adjacent community, which are folks who, they work in jobs that maybe they deal with spatial questions. They just haven't had a need to invest in a full-blown GIS software package. So they come over to us and say, hey, how do I open this? I need to use this information, but I don't have anything that will work with it. So we field questions for those folks. I have directed them to QGIS in the past for very simple things. I have done some work for them in the past. So in addition to storing and hoarding and distributing spatial data, we also do try to work as a statewide GIS help desk. There are lots of people out there who are just discovering the technology or who are rediscovering the technology. And they have questions. So I do my darndest to make up answers that sound like they might be right in some parallel universe, and sometimes they are. I love my job. I love being here to help folks. I love being here to make sure that this information is available to anybody who needs it. Otherwise, I would not have come back when they asked me to take over management. We are constantly trying to improve the clearinghouse. We are constantly trying to make sure that the servers are stable, that they are available for what they need. We are expanding our storage space as necessary. Everything MISDIS is now run from the University of Missouri Arts and Sciences computing cloud. So we have gotten off of physical hardware. In most cases, it's just a matter of me calling Do It Up and saying, hey, could we tack on a few more terabytes? Because I'm about to get a new statewide delivery, which is a heck of an improvement over 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when we would have to source out new hard drives. So there are still plenty of challenges out there. I am right now in the process of negotiating server upgrades so we can move MISDIS yet again to new virtual machines. But it's all worth it to make sure that this information is available, and to make sure that it's put to good use. I mean, you guys paid to have it created, so hopefully somebody's out there using it as intended. And thank you for having me. I really appreciate being able to evangelize.
Yeah, no problem, Tom. I can tell you that we are big fans of MISDIS at WashU, besides being, as you mentioned, collaborators and partners in the storage. Specifically, WashU stores all of the LiDAR data that comes in. So if you didn't know that, fun fact. And yeah, we appreciate it. I think I feel a little old because I do remember those old FTP days of MISDIS, and it has been really interesting to see how the platform has evolved as spatial data infrastructure has become more common and how that has evolved. So yeah, it's been an interesting transformation from an outsider looking in. So thanks a lot. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. I'm going to move on to our home team here. And I'm going to invite Seth to share his screen and tell us a little bit about the project that he and Aisha have been working on.
All right. Thank you. So I have a project that will possibly seem somewhat elementary in its current iteration. Especially to people who are familiar with tools capable of doing vastly more than we have yet done. So describing Paris in the 19th century started as a complement to a book project of mine about the idea of modernity, what it was to think of yourself as a modern subject, and its development in the observation and description of urban spaces. In the 19th century, people, when this notion arose of being modern, people saw that Paris was the quintessentially modern city, much more so than just about any other place in the world. So a deeper look at how people interacted with urban space in Paris could shed light on how they defined and experienced modernity. What places and what activities were considered essential to be a modern inhabitant or visitor in Paris. And writers and artists understood what it meant to be modern by observing the changing city and presenting it in text and in images. And to discover their experiences, we've gathered a variety of texts that describe famous landmarks of 19th century Paris. We could also have taken slightly different tack. Visitors to Paris were also fascinated by things that we today would probably not consider monuments. The sewer system. Visitors were told that they needed to go visit the abattoirs because they were highly industrial and scientific and sophisticated. The prisons also were on in the guidebooks, but we're not doing those. So our sources range from those that people would typically search for when looking for descriptions of Paris, like guidebooks and travelogues, to literary ones like novels that also contain plenty of writing about the city, to much more mundane pieces of what I would have called topographic literature. Anybody at the end of the day decided that what he really needed to do, and they are usually he's, really needed to do was describe a place or a monument, usually in the service of some kind of argument. So how do we get the texts? Well, the texts are available in the digital collection of the French National Library, but locating large numbers of passages about specific landmarks in the city is still a labor-intensive job. And to do this properly, we'd like to be working on the scale, not of documents that I can gather myself, say between 100 and 1,000, but rather probably at least one order of magnitude higher. If we get to the scale of 10,000 documents, that begins to be a bit more, it begins to get qualitatively different from what I can do individually. So although there is a keyword search feature on the National Library website in the most simple-minded way, why not use that? Well, finding particular passages about specific places requires users to skim through lots of text still. So automation with Python scripts built on the natural language processing toolkit addressed this problem and compiled a set of passages of interest. Now, our text currently exists as XML files that contain passages including names of specific locations in the city. Now, after we run these through a classifier constructed via machine learning, we review them by hand to determine whether they're useful for the project, and then we clean up the text by hand to fix the many OCR errors. And then comes the problem of displaying them. Until now, these passages have never been presented geospatially, visualized on maps of current Paris or 19th century Paris, so that users who would range from scholars to undergraduate students to visitors to the city today can click on a place on the map, Cathedral of Notre Dame, the Louvre, and learn what people wrote about it. And so this part of the project proposes an interactive map that allows users to click on a place and to read about it. And so I will just do the necessary here to share the screen, and we'll share that desktop. And you all should be looking now at a leaflet map of Paris. If I zoom out one step here, it'll look a little bit more familiar. We still need a little polygon here. We're missing a polygon for part of the Seine. And we're also still missing labels. But if I zoom in, you'll get an idea of what we've got. And if I click on one of these dots, this one happens to be Notre Dame, a pop-up here appears and it gives us textual passages that are in the database so far related to it. The current version of this database is about 200, between 200 and 220 texts that went in raw at the front end. Not all of them proved useful. And not all of them have yet been cleaned up. What is now in the map version are only those texts that humans have cleaned. So that's that part of the process is still time consuming. I will I will stop this share here unless Aisha wants me to continue. Well, I can start it again if Aisha needs it. I'll stop that. Anyway, to sum up, and before Aisha will talk more specifically about the geospatial aspects of this project, the current aim is to make this map more interactive, to add some features to it so that users could more easily sort for specific time periods, or we'd add a timeline across the bottom. That's one of my ideas. There are other ways I would want to make it more useful for literary scholars such as myself, but that's, you know, kind of back-end stuff built in JavaScript for sorting and searching inside the text. The idea is that it would allow us to better observe and analyze physical changes as described by the cultural producers of the era, the writers, the artists. It would also allow us to explore descriptions of a few places that no longer exist or are no longer tourist destinations, but were quite popular in the 19th century. And this interactive map would allow for a different kind of tour of the French capital during a century of many important physical and social transformations, letting people catch a glimpse of what people from the era were saying about their own city. And it would also require an engagement with passages of text, with texts that are typically not deemed interesting anymore, but that nonetheless reveal a great deal about urban spaces, culture, and society, and that make us better readers. So that is, in a nutshell, the map portion. A later phase of this project has much more to do with virtual and augmented reality. I would like to, in short, build the machine that will take textual description and illustrations and turn them into VR or AR for spaces that no longer physically exist in the state that they were in, so that it would be possible, I want to turn it loose on Paris, of course, it would be possible to visit virtually 19th century Paris, but once we have the machine, there's no reason it could not be used for another city in another time. If Paris of the Commune is interesting to me and to a certain group of people I know, it might also be interesting to visualize, to find description and images of certain parts of St. Louis that no longer exist and create VR or AR for them. For instance, wouldn't it be neat to see, to walk around in fact, St. Louis's lost Chinatown, bulldozed, of course, in order to create Busch Stadium, or some other aspect of the city that has been occulted, paved over, or otherwise destroyed. I would note that these are disproportionately parts of the city that have to do with the minority histories of St. Louis. Anyway, that's the next step, a much broader, a much larger project. But maybe I should stop there and introduce Aisha, who has worked on this project 2 summers, including from she was right out of her first year at Washington University. This happened because my wife, who's a professor of art history, and Aisha is at least one of her majors is art history, said, "I have this really amazing undergraduate. Can she help you? Can we find something?" And I said, "I think I can find something, yes." So Aisha's worked now for 2 summers. She came back and has been doing most of the GIS stuff. My first the first thing I said to her was, "Well, I learned QGIS. Why don't you learn? Why don't you start there?" So that's the map has really been her part of the project. Aisha.
Yeah, I'm Aisha. I'm a junior. I'm double majoring in art history and Arabic, and then my minor is in digital humanities. Like Professor Graber mentioned, I've worked with him on his Paris project the past 2 summers with the digital humanities summer workshop, and I focused on the GIS component of the project, which involved like mapping out like a basic map of Paris in QGIS. So most of the GIS component in the early stages, but like I mainly use QGIS in the beginning, and then connecting those text snippets that reference the specific places in Paris, so that you'd be able to click on it, make it more interactive, so that whenever you like clicked on a specific place, those text snippets would pop up. That mostly involved leaflet. So my part of the project has mostly involved both QGIS and leaflet, like transferring that information from QGIS to leaflet to make it more interactive.
Awesome, thanks. So many things about your project I just love. And yes, you know, when you look at the map, there are only a few layers there, but I definitely would not call this project simple in any way, shape, or form, especially knowing what had to happen before we could even see a point on a map. And I think that that is something that people new to geospatial or people outside of the geospatial realm just don't quite understand how much work goes into the data preparation so we can see a quote unquote simple map on the screen. So yeah, I love everything about this project. And I really also love that all the different technologies you are using, and then also that this is a great example of geospatial in the humanities, which is something that I think is growing in terms of interest from a lot of different areas. So thanks a lot for the intro and the explanation of your project. So I'm going to kick us off in terms of the discussion part with kind of a foundational question. I'm going to let Jim handle this one. And it's kind of like an intro one. We just want to hear in your mind, Jim, what are the major pros of using open source and what are the major drawbacks?
I think those two things are combined. The pros and drawbacks are the same in that the power that's available to you, and power is dangerous. Power is very tricky. And so the thing about open source is that it doesn't have any bounds. If you fire up Microsoft Word, you can do things in Microsoft Word. And when you reach the edge of what's supported in Microsoft Word, you stop and you don't use Microsoft Word anymore. You can do what you can do in there. But that is not true for open source tools. You'll have certain things that are easy and you'll find an example and you do that, and that's great. What if you want to do something just one step beyond? You want to customize, you want to change, you want to look at it a new way? The answer is always yes. But it's always costly. It's always, you have to learn, you have to explore, you have to gain capabilities as a person rather than consume them from someone else. And so it's this dangerous world to live in where there's always something there that you could work harder on and you could get further and you could build more and more, and you get sucked out of whatever it is you were doing and into becoming a programmer. This is what happened to me. I was a computational neuroscientist, so I was building brain models, but we gradually spent more time on our software than on our science and poured it into open source, and suddenly we're building tools for all domains, including GIS. And that's great, we do a great job, but we lost track of our science. And so that's kind of the problem here, is that there's infinite power right at your fingertips, but it takes work, it takes effort, and then you end up reprogramming your brain. Whereas if you're comfortable just sitting in QGIS and doing what QGIS does, that's great. And you get your work done, but then you just have to say no to certain things. And so there's always this tension between developing and exploring and just getting your work done. So that's the good and bad thing about OSS.
Agreed. Would any other panelists like to comment on specific pros or cons that they've experienced using open source tools? Feel free to just unmute and
yeah, I could say a couple of things. I imagine Aisha might as well, because she had to search and find out quite a few solutions to problems. One of the things that I have been particularly appreciative of is the quantity, the size and the quality of the open source hive mind or community. You know, it's just so much better than looking at someone saying, well, you could go to the Microsoft Learning Center and read their, you know, was this article helpful? No, it wasn't most of the time. But with the open source communities around something, I mean, chances are someone else has had the problem, and chances are that they've come up with some solution. That said, I think we are kind of, in my project, reaching the limits of leaflet. We certainly ran hard into the limits of a QGIS plugin, QGIS to leaflet, that caused a lot of trouble for us and endless back and forth, and we never solved a lot of that. I think another advantage that Jim didn't mention is perhaps it's too like the no-brainer. Not everybody who works on or with the Paris project here is going to have access to WashU's licensing resources.
Yeah,
it's as simple as that. They're just not, and so it's a matter of using Python and using open source tools whenever I possibly can. And up to now, I think I've kept it in exclusively that way, is a way of future-proofing the project. Because people outside WashU could work on it, or all kinds of things can happen within WashU. We've seen it repeatedly that WashU has decided in its infinite wisdom that it will change platforms for something based on, and these may not be entirely commercial decisions. You know, in the private sector, we'd expect that would be a commercial decision. I suppose it could be at WashU too, but at any rate, moving away, you know, should WashU 1 year decide that we're no longer going to support ArcGIS? Kind of hard to imagine, but well, you know, we'd all be out of luck on some level. And that's not really the way scholarship can work. Scholarship has to be preserved the best way we know how. Up to now, that has been the paper volume. So we have to, I think we have to use open source as much as possible if we don't intend to become bound to what are, after all, commercial products.
Yeah, the whole emphasis on portable, reproducible, collaborative projects is throughout the Python OSS ecosystem. It's always a theme. It's always an unrealized goal of being able, but at least licensing isn't stopping you. What's stopping you is practical concerns about being able to reproduce someone else's environments. What do you mean? You had a different version? Oh no, it's hard. So there's a horrible mess with that. But that horrible mess comes from the fact that you have a bunch of independent people throwing things out there, and you're trying to pick and choose and then reproduce them, but at least it's possible. At least scholarship is possible, and sharing and collaboration is possible. And as a former professor, just having one student start on a project and then take that project to another university and then start working on it, or to a private company and start working on it, that free flow of projects between people and institutions is super important. And as soon as there's a boundary there, as soon as there's a paywall, then that stops the free flow just immediately.
Yeah, those are really great points, and they actually kind of feed into questions that I was planning to ask, but really have been tackled already. I know that when in one of my first meetings with Seth and Aisha, I said, why are you using this? Why aren't you using ArcGIS Online? And at WashU, yes, we are an Esri shop basically, but we do we do support open source tools, and we are constantly working to increase our support for open source tools. SUS project was a great example of kind of pushing me to up my leaflet game. That was for sure. But it was so fun. And it also tackles another question that I was going to ask, which was, advantages of open source. And I think that the cross-institutional angle is a perfect answer to that. And I think that sometimes in WashU, since we have this set of tools kind of handed to us, maybe, at least in my case, I don't look outside the box as much as I should, and kind of keep these kind of issues in mind. I kind of just assume, oh yes, it's going to be WashU faculty and WashU students. Okay, cool, Esri, let's do it. But I need to kind of think more globally in terms of who's going to be working on these projects and who's going to be consuming them. So I really appreciate those points.
I could say,
yeah, go ahead, please.
Those are all great points. But one thing I would add is, in some cases, open source is just easier to work with. This is when I'm not doing MSDIS things in the summertime. I also teach a fully online Intro to GIS course. Now, that doesn't mean anything anymore because all courses are fully online, but mine was fully online before it was cool to be fully online. And also a matter of life and death. And back a couple of years ago, we originally, obviously, designed the course to revolve around Arcgis, as you do when you're teaching an Intro GIS course. That worked great when it was still in the classroom and we had a lab that was fully licensed and I didn't have to worry about it. But when we took this online, and suddenly, not only did we not have a lab available to us, but we were asking students to, well, you got to make your Arc Online account or your ESRI account, and then you got to go here to download, and then you got to go here to put in the license, and then you put this code in. That's a lot of steps if you aren't already really, it's a lot of steps for anybody. I hate it. It's a pain. Now, I'm not going to stop using ESRI products. I see no scenario in which Mizzou, decides to cancel our contract. But from a standpoint of just getting somebody up and running, there's a lot of hoops to jump through with existing ESRI products versus go to the QGIS website, download this thing and install it, and then go forth and complete this assignment. And a couple of years ago, I think it was 2 summers ago, I just converted the class over, partly because of the number of students who were having trouble following the desktop instructions, partly because a lot of these kids come to school with Apple laptops and they don't know how to run parallels, or they don't want to figure it out. And, that locks them out right there. So from a purely instructional standpoint, I think there's a really good case to be made that an open source option is, in some cases, just easier for people to work with. Now, like Jim was saying, that can get really complicated in a hurry once you hit the upper limit of that open source resource. But starting out, I will recommend somebody work with QGIS any day of the week if they have to set it up by themselves. So that's just one of my observations from the sidelines.
I could say that as a beginning GIS learner, I went through Jennifer Moore's course a couple of years ago, which was taught with Arcgis. I ran into precisely the problem because my laptop runs on Linux. And so instantly I would have to run, get a virtual machine. Well, I did get a virtual machine. Well, okay, so running a virtual machine and it's working, relatively decently. ArcGIS is working. I found two things. One was that maybe because it was the second GIS software I learned, QGIS just seemed easier at most steps. And secondly, ArcGIS, both on my machine and even in the lab, crashed a lot more often than QGIS. And that was a fairly good recommendation there about what I ought to be using, I think. That said, in teaching, I continue to use Esri story maps and ArcGIS Online just because they've built that massive JavaScript front end that looks great. Beautiful. And enables students who know nothing about GIS and to whom I can't teach it because first, I'm not competent, I'm not Jennifer Moore. And second, this is a course about something totally different and I don't really want to teach a whole GIS segment. It enables students who know nothing about GIS to build a map for demonstration purposes in the space of 10 minutes. And that's a very valuable thing. So thank you, Esri. Story maps are great.
The Arc Online story map platform, it has really, I think, revolutionized how we get GIS to not GIS people. I think it is an ideal vector for us taking data, doing what we do with data, and then packaging it in a better, more easily understood end product. And we have tried to take advantage of that a lot at MSDIS. And you're right, it does, if you just need to teach somebody how to make a basic map that looks nice and it is accessible to others, I think it's a great platform if you have it available. If it's all set up, if it's ready to go. Yeah, I love leveraging that software. And a couple of my interns have noted that some of the projects they've done for me have earned them interviews out in the great wide world because they're just able to say, hey, I did this thing. So no, it's a fantastic platform and I love it to death. I will say though, getting back to the instructional side of things, I unless I'm forced to, I do not see myself going back to Arc Desktop or Arc Pro as the software for my intro class at all. Not because they are bad products, not because you can't teach somebody to set them up, but because, and this is just my own personal, I don't know, bias, view, what have you. I think it's more important to teach somebody, and this, I don't know, Seth or Jim, you touched on this earlier. I think it's more important to teach somebody how to think through GIS than it is to push this button and then push this button and then open this tool and drag this into this field and that into the other field. We've gotten really comfortable, and I'm not criticizing anybody specifically. I'm not criticizing any class I've taken. I'm not criticizing any class anybody's teaching. But GIS instruction in general, I think, has gotten really comfortable with teaching people how to use ESRI software rather than teaching people how to approach GIS as a concept. And I think open source software like QGIS is a good way to mitigate that. If students have to think about how to adapt, oh, well, this was this tool in Q, so this must do this thing in Arc. I think that's a good way to frame the introduction to the world of GIS. Because let's face it, I mean, in a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, ESRI is going to change the interface of Pro anyway, and all of those blanks are going to move around. And I'm going to be sitting here saying, hey, I just figured that out. Shaking my fist at Jack Dangerman. It's going to be a great program. It's going to work well. It's going to do what it needs to do. But there's going to be this, my concern is that there's going to be this generation of GIS students who are going to sit here and look at that and go, well, it's broken now because I don't know how to do this in the new version. So I really do think that open source solutions are a good option for teaching those cornerstones in such a way as it doesn't rely on a specific heads-up interface.
You know, I'd like to stick with the educational direction, the instructional direction, but maybe come at it from a different angle. And Aisha, I hope you don't mind that I spotlight you a little bit, but as a student who is fully immersed into your student experience right now, what has your classroom instruction experience been with open source tools, if your classroom experience has focused on like technical tools? Like what are your preferences in terms of tools that you know are just completely open, you could use them forever, or tools that might be the market leader, but you know that you may not be able to access them when you finish your time at WashU?
I mean, most of my classes haven't been anything like directly related to digital humanities. So I don't know if I can think of like a specific like time or class where we've actually used something that was open source. Especially with like a lot of like humanities classes. Like open source tools are not really something that comes up that often.
Sure. Gotcha. We do have some comments in the chat that I just want to reiterate here. Some definite thumbs up to the foundational building blocks of GIS and geospatial. I think we'd all probably agree with that. That is going to be your foundation before you even start clicking buttons. At least I hope. I know that that's not always the case, but it should be. And then also Jennifer brings up a good point, which is, and I'll just quote her here, my favorite aspect of open source is the equity issue, both in terms of licensing and the term of technology. And I think that that is a really good point. We know that Esri products, you've got to have that Windows license, and that's an additional cost often on top of that. And so I think that open source tools, in the fact that a lot of them are cross-platform, it can really help with the issue of folks maybe not being able to get that Windows machine. Maybe they are using Linux or a different operating system. So yeah, I don't know if any of our panelists have any thoughts specifically to the equity issue.
I guess in my work, it's an afterthought because everything is built on Python. Everything is open source. Occasionally oh yeah, that didn't work on Windows. We better figure that out. It's weird, but it's just our daily life is not worrying about it. It's just always open by default for all the projects that I'm ever touch on. And if you wanted to do something specific to an OS, it'd be weird. And so I even forget that that's a problem for other people.
I feel like that's a good thing.
I think it is.
The equity issue, it is a really good point. And I think in a lot of cases, we do overlook that aspect of it, but it is there. That is a real thing. I have had folks come to me from rural Missouri who are not going to have the latest and greatest hardware, software to use. They are not going to be able to run Arc Pro. They may not have a dedicated internet connection at home, so they're not going to be able to use Arc Online. So something that they can go to the library, download, install, and run real quick without having excess income to throw at one license or another license or a series of them, it makes a huge difference. It levels the playing field in a lot of really important ways. So that is a fantastic point.
I would say there's another slightly different part of the equity issue here. It isn't just licensing costs. It's easy for open source, compete. Licensing costs of 0 wins hands down. The other issue, though, where open source does not always compete tremendously well, is perceived and comprehensibility. The fact is, most computer users are probably used to a Windows desktop. And if we really want our stuff to be available, across the city of St. Louis or across Missouri to people who work at some disadvantage compared to those of us in a university with the time to learn how to run things off a command line, the inclination to do so, we probably have to make it work in Windows. We probably have to make it work in several years ago version of Windows on a fairly, kind of a low to medium spec machine. So really, it's not just about licensing, it's also about how the thing looks. Does it look like a thing that a user not familiar with the command line could even consider deploying?
Yeah, and I would go further than that even. It's not just about make it work, but make it easily appear to work. Make it easy to because it can work. It will work. With open source, you will be able to make it work, but it will appear not to work for quite a while for a new user. It'll appear like this thing is totally broken. It's not broken. You didn't set that. Of course you have to set this. Of course, well, you didn't do this. Like that whole rigmarole drives off huge swaths of people. And the thing about open source is fundamental to open source is that the people who can fix that are the people who don't need that. The people who can ease the new user experience are not new users themselves. And the ones who can fix it, they don't need any of that. They skip over the 4 broken instructions that didn't realize open a window first. Oh, I didn't know I need to do that. But they know they need to do that. So that's the systematic problem affecting open source. It cannot be solved in any trivial way, because the people who do the work are the people who don't need that work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when they appear more complex to use, that is going to be a barrier that disproportionately affects people who don't have the CS background.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point, Seth. And I think something that maybe might generally be overlooked in the equity conversation. Just pointing out a couple of comments here. I do want to give a plug for the, since we were talking about foundational concepts, Doris and Bill gave a great workshop yesterday on geodesy. So you can't really get more foundational than that. So please do check that out, probably in a week or two when that gets posted on the data services webpage. I'm going to switch directions a little bit and give Jim kind of a targeted question here, since he is kind of our industry rep, if you will. So we've talked, it's been mentioned several times that, the price tag is pretty good for open source stuff. You work for a company that has a product that you can download for free and run. So what is the value being added there? And if I can put it bluntly, how are you making money?
Let me separate Anaconda from my own group, because the answer is different there.
Right on.
Anaconda makes its money from, it packages open source so that you can mix and match and combine it. So it's mostly not writing the open source involved. Mostly it's putting in packages that allow you to put these 9 packages together and figure out which versions are compatible and do that. And that part is all free, except that we, as of a year ago, we made that not free for large commercial organizations. And the idea was that these are somebody has to pay for the human beings to do all of this work. And the idea is that, well, the ones who are getting commercial value from it ought to be the ones who are putting that money back in. And so it was a terms of service change. And that has worked really well because basically Fortune 500 is now funding Anaconda. And it's appropriate because they're deriving a ton of commercial value from it. So meanwhile, academia is still completely free. And so there are human beings who are paid by corporate America to do work that benefits academic institutions. So that's a pretty good arrangement. That's Anaconda's arrangement. I run a separate subgroup within Anaconda, and we do consulting. So companies come to us with a problem and we say, oh, these open source tools will solve 80% of your problem today. You want us to show you how to do that? Pay us some money. We can also make it solve the last 20%. Pay us money for that too. They give us the money. We put that, we create open source tools and improve the open source tools. We put that app back out into the open source. So the company that paid us or the government agency that paid us, they don't get the private IP. We wrote custom code, but it doesn't go to them. It goes into the open source tool. And they like that because that way other people build on it. And we're building up the capabilities of open source gradually. And they only had to pay for this bit, but they get this bit. And they're going to get this bit tomorrow and this bit tomorrow from everyone else who lines up with a problem. Anyone has a problem, they come to us. They pay us money. It pays the salaries of our engineers, and the open source tools get better. They got something like 100-to-1 ratio on their investment. They only paid for something this big and they got that big. So everybody kind of benefits, including my team, who's always working on a new problem. So it's always interesting to them. Whereas if you're in a commercial consulting arrangement, your job would be to write the same software over and over to different customers and get paid each time. We don't do that. We never write the same thing twice. We're paid, so everybody's happy because we're working on open source and it's all great, and we're paid not charity salaries, but actual salaries. And the reason we can be paid that is that the value we're giving the company is very high because they don't need an 80% solution. They need a 100% solution. So they pay us money. They get a 100% solution really cheaply, really quickly. And we feel good because we're contributing to open source. So it's a little subgroup of Anaconda that does that.
That's really interesting. I'm going to switch to, we've been talking about tools primarily here so far. I'm going to switch to the data side. And so Tom, this is going to be for you. As data consumers, so you're putting this data out there and there's so much open data out there now.
Right.
Sometimes there never seems to be exactly what you need, but that's a whole different topic. But as consumers of data, how can we become data savvy? How can we become savvy consumers of this ocean of open data that's available to us now?
That is a great question that I wish I had a great answer to, because I think about it a lot. And real quick, there's a question in the chat asking if MSDIS is Missouri focused, are there comparable organizations for data from other regions? There should be, yes. Generally speaking, each state has its own spatial data clearinghouse. And I can, from my own experience, I work regularly with my partner sister sites from Kansas, Iowa, Illinois, Arkansas, basically neighboring states. And now I am not familiar with the entities in the Southwest and Mountain West, but I would be shocked if they do not exist. I would say Google whatever state you're looking for, GIS Clearinghouse, and you are likely to find out where that clearinghouse lies. That is a very valuable segue into my answer to Molly's question. I'm always worried that when I give the answer that is my gut instinct. It's going to sound like I'm trying to gatekeep GIS data, which I'm not. But I want to make sure that people find the data that are useful and legitimate to their purposes, and not just whatever somebody put out there. Because Molly is correct in that we are basically drowning in a sea of open data options at this point. Thanks to tools like ArcGIS Online, where anybody with an account can download something, make some minor changes to it and re-upload it. You know, it's very, very difficult to be able to tell what data are legitimate, what data are value added, and what data are just garbage that somebody put out there for hijinks, or something that Ms. Roads _test, Ms. Roads _test_1, Ms. Roads _test_ this is the real one _1. You know, if somebody wanted to, they could download the latest quarterly MoDOT roads, clip out a county, add a new field to it, fill that in as they see fit, you know, road quality, and load it back up. It could have virtually the same metadata as the original, just with this person's extra attribute tacked onto it. So it is incredibly important that you know where the data are coming from, that you just don't download the first thing that seems like it matches what you are looking for. And to that end, I think that state clearinghouses, be they MSDIS, be they DASC in Kansas, or whatever is out there in the Southwest and Mountain West, I think that those organizations will become increasingly important as data becomes easier to upload, as it becomes easier to upload your version of whatever shapefile exists to the cloud. And that's a total 360 from my feelings, you know, just a few years ago. I would be lying straight to the camera if I said I'm never going to be worried that, you know, ESRI is just going to create their own comprehensive clearinghouse that umbrellas all of the state clearinghouses. Yeah, I think that's a very real possibility. I mean, most of the state clearinghouses that I work with now are using Arc Online in some fashion, because it works, because it's easy, and because that's what's expected of us. So if ESRI was so inclined, yes, they probably could set up their own clearinghouse of clearinghouses. But that comes with the caveat that each of these state clearinghouses has the added value of working directly with the actual people on the actual ground actually making the data. I have working relationships with the folks in Jeff City who are updating MoDOT roads and who are updating our hospitals every month. And I think there is value there. And I think that's why the clearinghouse model is, it is at least going to stick around for a while. And I think that model is really the key, or one of the keys, to making sense of this wild, wild west of open data. Doing business with known entities, or entities that are themselves doing business with known entities. Because it's so strange to me that we've sort of gone full circle. When I started in GIS, you could go to Lighthouse or what was there were any number of GIS distribution centers, and you kind of knew what you were downloading, but maybe not. I mean, it seemed okay, and it said it was coming from an agency, but And then the clearinghouse model was sort of implemented to clean things up. And now we've come back around to Arcgis Online. And it is a test. It is a taxing situation, but in its own way, it has its advantages because you can seek out other scholars who are working on similar projects to you, and you can work with them directly, which is another, I guess, suggestion for helping make sense of it. Email the distributor. Email me, ask questions. That's what I'm here for. Look, read the metadata. Contact whoever is listed in the contact info in the metadata. If the metadata aren't filled out, that's probably a good sign you shouldn't be using those data. If they are,
that actually is a great segue into a question that Jennifer posted to you. Before I read it, I want to just give a warning that after this question, we'll go ahead and open it up to the floor. So if you've got a question on the tip of your tongue, feel free to get ready to ask that or type it in the chat. But Tom, in terms of metadata, which we all know and love here in data services, how do you address the varying metadata / documentation that accompanies the data sets that you provide or that you put out there?
That is a phenomenal question. It's hilarious in its own way to look back at older MSDIS data sets that have no metadata filled out. They came with like a text document that somebody said, I made this on this day using this stuff for this person. And at the time that was good enough, right? I have personally led a couple of metadata workshops around the state that have had some pretty good attendance by states, agency employees and managers. And we have been working with them over the years to sort not to say you have to fill metadata out this way using these codes, using this exact language and this text. I am never going to go to DHSS or SEMA or SEMO or anybody and say, look, you need to do metadata exactly this way. Truth, I am happy whenever anybody fills out any part of the metadata. Because the agencies we work with mostly use ESRI products, they are filling out metadata in Arc Catalog or Arc Pro. So by default, it is something that I can read and something that I can integrate into Arc Online. Most people who have worked with me to distribute data in the past, I have specifically sat down or emailed with them one-on-one and saying, so, for example, you filled out most of the information. We have contact info. We've got this and this. What I would really like for you to include in the next version of this is maybe a brief description here, and just in this abstract below it, a line of text saying this data set was created by such and such agency. And these folks have been fantastic about working with me and about integrating those requests into their metadata creation processes. It's at the point now where I really don't have to do much at all to change the metadata that we receive from folks. 10 years ago, we would have to rewrite the whole document, and it would take me a day to get a couple of data sets posted to MSDIS. These days, we can integrate it and send it on its way in less than an hour. The caveat to all of that is when we are working with entities outside of the state. The Census Bureau, for instance, the shape files that they have developed and distribute through their Census FTP are written in at least they were over the last couple of years, are written in it is a non-native format that Arc Catalog does not readily read. It's there. The metadata are there. The file is physically there, but the census used to provide it in both in multiple formats, so that regardless of what software you were using, you could read the data natively. Now that's no longer the case. So now when I make census data available on MISDIS, for one thing, it's not available on our open data site because it would require open heart surgery to make it ESRI compatible. But in the MISDIS file server, I go in there and open it up, and I create a metadata document for each of those files that says, as of I think it was 16 or 17, US Census Bureau no longer provides metadata in a compatible format. Please see the attached file included in this download for the full details. And it's a pain in the butt because we probably distribute, I think, 24 census files, which is 24 times I have to change that every year or do that every year. But if that's what it takes to get those data, to isolate Missouri and get those data available so somebody else doesn't have to do it, it's a small price to pay in the overall grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think, Tom, that's another great example of something dealing with geospatial that folks may not necessarily think about or know even exists until they, get into it and try to figure those things out.
It's a strange situation because those of us who are familiar with it are familiar with it. Mm-hmm. We know to look for it. We don't like writing it, but we damn sure like it when other people write it. We expect it to be there. We just don't want to have to do it.
Yeah.
So it's a bizarre situation at this point. Mm-hmm. The sooner we can all agree on a format, the sooner I will be a much happier data archivist.
Agreed. All right. So does anyone from the audience want to type or ask a question to any of our panelists or to the group as a whole?
I have a sort of meta question. Does anyone have a suggestion for something that's truly missing in the open source that you rely on all the time, and you've looked and you have not found something like it? And story maps is one of those things, but are there other things that are like that?
Yeah, that's really excellent.
Because we can make something that looks like a story map, but it takes a lot of work. And it's not the ease of use of that is what's not available. So things like that, I'd love to hear them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jim, what as a user of both open source and Esri technologies, one thing that I do appreciate about Esri is that a lot of the underlying geospatial processes that we talk about, like these concepts that we were talking about earlier, can be wrapped up nicely into like one geoprocessing tool. And sometimes there's not necessarily equivalence in the open source, but I think that does kind of get to down to how open source tools tend to, well, let's just say that Esri tools gloss over a lot. And in terms of like defaults and things like that, in open source tools, you often have so much more control over like the tiniest of little parameters that you're looking for. And so that requires not only knowing the conceptual foundation, but also just knowing kind of how spatial data works. Like, for example, we've been talking about Leaflet a little bit, and Leaflet, to be honest, as I've worked with it more, I've understood that Leaflet doesn't necessarily know what a layer is, but what Leaflet does know is like a series of points or vertices in a polygon and a polyline. And so you would kind of need to know that really when we're talking about spatial data, we are kind of talking about just collections of points in space. And so I guess that, you know, I really, I don't know if I'm asking for more glossing over or appreciating not glossing over, but I do like kind of the ease of use of Esri's tools. They kind of like package up this concept in a tool, here you go. So maybe more of that in open source, I guess, at least for the beginner crowd would be one of my asks. But I'd be happy to hear anybody else's thoughts on that.
I think that's a very good ask, and it'd be the sort of thing that Anaconda does for packaging, which is to put things together, but now at a conceptual level, to put things together so that the things are laid out in a hierarchy of concepts rather than a hierarchy of tools. We have a hierarchy of tools around there, and we can mix and match tools, but we don't have an interface on top that is geared at a particular level for a particular audience, because everything's just thrown out there by lots of people and assembled. And that's great, but I don't know if any group is working to assemble it in a way that is digestible by this particular audience. And that's something a coalition of people could do. You might be able to write a grant proposal and build on the things that are already out there, all the capabilities there, but it's not digestible and not presented and not curated in that way. And that's a lot of work to do, and it has to be done by people in the field. Anaconda can't do that. We're not GIS professionals. We can do power. We can't do ease in that same way.
Anybody else have any wish list items for Jim?
Yeah, we have to say no to that one.
Yeah, I don't know that I don't have a wish list item. I had another question that comes from my role in teaching undergraduates and teaching also graduate students who are often in the humanities more and more interested in data science, data applications. Occasionally in Python. So for Jim, what are you looking for? Whom are you looking to hire? What skills should we be trying to instill, to the extent we can, in our students? Because St. Louis is not a bad place to be in geospatial business. Mm-hmm. Also not a bad place actually to be in, thinking about Python or other sorts of coding tools. What is your outfit looking to hire?
Well, I think I'd separate into who would be hired in Anaconda as opposed to who's hired by Anaconda's customers who are using all that Anaconda is putting out there. And I think that group is much more relevant, because we hire a bunch of people who know JavaScript, and that's to build our tools that are designed to hide the JavaScript from the Python user. And so our users don't need to know JavaScript because we hired people who do. Yeah. And the same for some of the core numerical computing. We hire a bunch of people who spend all their days thinking about columns of numbers and very in the weeds stuff. And we hire those people so that nobody else has to. Whereas at our customer level, our customers generally hire people who have some domain knowledge and some computer literacy. Not computer deep in the weeds, but they are literate with what computers can do, with what the open source system has in it, and how to apply those to solve problems that matter to someone. Whereas we hire the people who solve the very esoteric problems, and we don't even tell them what they're for sometimes. We just tell them it needs to do this. And then they put their heads down and they're working till 4 a.m. and they get it together, and we take that and then we provide that to our customers who are using it to solve something real that's not technical, but is relevant for a domain. And so for those people, it's all of our customers will hire you if you have familiarity with what's out there in the open source world and how to apply that to solve a real problem. And so we're not the experts on that. It's all our customers who are experts on that.
Certainly, speaking as a Python user who has not been terribly entertained by his encounters with JavaScript, we're really grateful that you are out there hiding the JavaScript from from Python users so that we don't have to do that part.
We do our best.
Seth, I was curious. You mentioned during the description of your project that you were planning on this idea of converting descriptions into actual like 3D models. And I'm curious, do you have do you have a clear plan for that, or is this kind of aspirational, or because that sounds, it sounds like a great outcome. I just don't know how you're going to realize that.
Well, it started certainly as aspirational, and it's become a little bit less so as I've looked around at what tools are out there. I think it would be possible using existing tools to come up with a system that will work for some limited menu of places. It would not work just universally out of the box. I don't know if I haven't figured out how to do that yet. But for instance, for what I do, thinking about 19th century Paris, I just realized, well, why would I, how do I create this model in my head? How do I, when I'm reading, how and why do I have a picture in my head? And I realized that, well, first it's because there is a great deal of visual documentation out there that I'm familiar with. So yeah, I can put an image to these words. And it's a result, it's because the 19th century published tons and tons of engravings. They got cheap in that century and people consumed them. And so they were produced in mass quantity, and many of them have, many of them have survived. Well, so if we gave the black box a repertoire of those pictures, with the right metadata attached, it could search the metadata and apply a library of details, of visual details, to structures, wire models, essentially MD files, coming out of either for specific places, specific named places, things that humans would have built, humans would have modeled, or from stuff generated procedurally. For instance, some street that that I don't particularly care about because it's in a neighborhood I find boring, that we know would have five-story buildings with balconies at floor 2 and floor 5, mansard roof on top, Haussmannian details along it, and we generate that procedurally and we drape some textures on it. That I think is the way to do that. The engine for placing it all would probably be Unity. Unity is a thing. Well, if you're familiar with it. For those who are not familiar with it, it's just a way of building a gaming world. So there's how people who build like World of Warcraft scenarios would use something like Unity. They probably don't use Unity itself, but it's something like Unity. And you can place models in a landscape. And that's how, and I believe it is possible to build a geolocated version world in Unity. So it's not just totally fantasy land. It actually is, corresponds to really existing places. And then we drop our models, both human-made and machine-made, into that world. And I can imagine that this would be fairly simple. It would be not a difficult matter to code the process of taking a map from a specific period and processing that into a Unity landscape, and then adding the machinery that says, okay, for this subset of known buildings, we're going to have to do special stuff, or humans are going to have to build stuff. But for the rest of it, it's going to be mostly procedural creation for the moment, at least.
Yeah.
So that's how I envision it at present. Now, I'm sure that the whole reason I'm thinking about this is that I'm pretty sure that other people with bigger budgets are also thinking of it. And my fear is, my knowledge is that already now we have machines reading books. That exists, basically. Well, that's not going to go away. And I'm invested in humans reading books, and I'm invested in encouraging them to read books and to read them better. And if we just do nothing, if we in literature do nothing about virtual reality or augmented reality, then Silicon Valley is going to do it. And a bunch of tech bros are going to own it. And we're not going to get, something that could conceivably be a research tool for somebody interested in the Paris Commune or in Balzac's city or in Dickens's London or in any moment of the history of St. Louis. Instead, we're going to get, hunting zombies in Paris.
Yeah.
And the tech bros are also going to end up somehow owning the data.
Yeah.
And that's even more insidious. So this is why I think we have to get involved with this, even though we don't really have the budget. And yes, I really would need, I would need 100 people familiar with model building in Blender.
Yeah. Well, and actually, let me turn that back on to James. I saw your tech bro little motion there.
Mea culpa.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious. He mentioned Unity and tools like that work with 3D. I mean, I know Blender is open source. Well, it's freely available. Is that kind of the type of resource that your holoviz.org group would be supporting, or
in principle, yes. In practice, scientific visualization splits into InfoViz and SciViz. And InfoViz is driven from two-dimensional presentation of information in general. SciViz is driven by things that have 3D coordinates. And SciViz has gone into an immersive realm that's based on 3D worlds, and InfoViz is based on paper. And they've had this a lot of things have been done twice, once in both camps, a lot of new ideas. They have different names in the two camps because they were done once, they were done independently. But this persists to this day in the tooling. Mostly the tooling is either in one camp or another, and there are very few tools that bridge that. In the R community, actually, some of the tools do bridge that. They have the identical visualization can be done as two-dimensional and three-dimensional, and you go back and forth, and it's really seamless. It's something we're jealous of from the Python community, because Python is fragmented and will always remain so, because each tool is really great at a certain thing. And if you were to try to bring them together, you'd have to give up on things. And so there are some projects to try to bring things together, but my group is firmly in the two-dimensional camp, either on a paper or on your screen. And whatever it is, we make it possible to explore arbitrarily dimensional things, but not immersively, because we make it possible to explore those spaces and choose the two-dimensional slice of it that you ever want to see at one time, and then use time to explore different things. And then we have colleagues, we have other tools that do this swim through, flyby, immersive. It isn't our thing, and we don't have the resources to do that. And there are other groups that do, and they're just going to be separate. And I don't know I don't see them not being separate in any near future.
Well, that discussion actually is a great segue into how I'd like to kind of gracefully bring this conversation to a close, and that is by asking all of you to predict the future. And also, just as a side note, Seth, I think you've definitely piqued our interest with kind of this next phase of your project. So let's definitely talk about that. We don't have 100 people, we just have 4, but we'll see what we can do. So yeah, I'm hoping that just to close out, each of you can just speak to where you see open source going. What is the future? We've kind of alluded to a lot of this already. This could be either a concrete, I've seen this happening, I feel like this is where it's going to go, or maybe like a wish list, like I want it to go this way. So perhaps why don't we start with Tom, and maybe you could just kind of let us know where you see open data and open source tools going.
So of course we're going to start with me with predicting the future. So that's also not great. I mean, it's not going away. That's obvious. Arc Online by itself has revolutionized data sharing and data, data application. We are going to be swimming through more and more shape files and feature services that people just put together and run up the flagpole, and it's not gonna stop. Now, do I think, and I'll sort of cheat this answer, do I think that eventually the individual clearinghouses are going to be united under one enormous banner? I do think that's possible. I would be surprised if that does not happen. Maybe not one enormous banner, but regional ones. I don't think it's at all outside of the realm of possibility that the Mid-America GIS Consortium, the magic clearinghouses, sort of Voltron together into a overarching magic clearinghouse. And I think, I think that happens sooner rather than later. Does that mean the individual entities go away? Probably not, because, I'll use Missouri as an example. It takes a lot of work and a lot of convincing to get some entities and localities to give up their data. And that's within the state. That's me saying, look, all I want to do is make this publicly available. If you want to strip out sensitive stuff from it so that it's sanitized, go for it. I just want to make some aspect of this available. They'll fight you tooth and nail, not out of any malicious activity or animosity. It's just, it is very territorial. So on the one hand, I do not see clearinghouses going away. On the other hand, I definitely see them working together in a much bigger fashion. And my hope is that in that aspect, we will be able to leverage more open data sources. We'll be able to make our open data available to more freely available platforms, such as Q and whatever cool things we're cooking up with Python.
Nice, thanks. Seth and Aisha, would you like to comment on what you'd like to see moving forward?
Well, I'm pretty happy with the way things are going. Many of the things I see in digital humanities, which is pretty committed to keeping its data open overall. I go to sometimes the Digital Humanities Summer Institute in Victoria when one can travel to Canada. And there, it's pretty clear. As Tom said, this is not going away. There are more people out there putting more stuff, making more stuff available. I guess more broadly in the thinking about the way people will experience worlds that don't immediately surround them, which is part of what literature is about. I I have to say that the Mark Zuckerberg version is really not my favorite, because I think that I don't particularly want to see Meta owning all of this. And I don't think that the idea of that masses, if you get enough data in one place, that substitutes for real experience. It just doesn't. We can't. Virtual reality is not the same as reality, and you don't make it reality by putting more data in. I think there's something else there. So, I think resisting the trend, resisting the idea that all of this would be privatized and by subscription is pretty important, because this is not about, at the end of the day, this is not about creating shareholder value. This is about creating knowledge and letting people have it.
Very well said. Aisha, would you like to add anything?
I mean, I guess in like a more broad sense, I feel like there's been a lot of like application of like digital humanities or like just like virtual reality for like cultural heritage preservation, especially in the context of like art historically significant sites, and especially like in sites that are at risk of being like damaged either by the environment or because of like war or something. And I think that's just a good like application of digital humanities, especially like preserving things that may not like exist in the future, and also making it more like in reach of people who may not be able to visit. So I hope that's like a trend that continues.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I'm sure that most people on this call agree with you and hope that is a direction that we can continue to go to make these spaces available in some way, shape, or form. Jim, you want to give us your thoughts?
All right. So I've been working in field of open source for about 30 years. And if you want to make a projection in the future, of course, you back up a little bit and follow a line from the past into the future. And if I really think about the last 10 years of the open source world, it has been dominated by commercial interests. Big companies with big plans are massively distorting open source universe and changing what's real, what's possible. And my company is one of those. The big companies everyone's heard of, Facebook was just mentioned. Facebook is one of those companies completely distorting the world of open source by channeling money into certain things and not others. And this happened before with the internet. Internet was an academic and government project, and it got commercialized and really, really ramped up just the basic functions of networks. And now academics will go in and you can have super fast worldwide connectivity that came from an academic project, but it's possible now because of this commercial involvement. That has huge benefits, but it also has gatekeepers who are not you, who are not us, or me as former academic and not you, current academics. All this power has come from the commercial involvement, but also all sorts of danger and all sorts of distortion. And the same has happened with open source. Open source, when I started doing open source, was some person who typed something up and put it out there. That is not open source now. There are a lot of competing interests. There's a lot of money behind the scenes. It's like politics. Wow, a law got made. No, a law did not get made. Money flowed. All sorts of people and interest happened, and then that law got made. The same for an open source package. All sorts of things are happening behind the scenes that people don't realize. Who's funding that? What are they up to? Why is that important to them? And there are all sorts of benefits that come from that, because all sorts of things get done for free and you can just use them and it's great. But there are all sorts of dangers as well. And you're not a stakeholder here. Lots of people with a lot more money than you, a lot more influence are the stakeholders who really are the movers and shakers. And the great thing about open source is that even if you aren't one of those, you can write on that and put your little thing on the side that retools something that was for Netflix's recommendation algorithm. You can retool it for your thing. But it's also dangerous. So that's what I'm predicting about the future, is that this is going to become even more obvious, even more dominant, because there's just so much money that's been poured in over the past 10 years. And now everything's in place that all these companies are depending on it. They are going to dominate the next 10 to 20 years of it, because it is now part of all these companies' bottom lines for goals that have nothing to do with academia, nothing to do with knowledge for its own sake, understanding. Those have to do with exploiting and commercializing and obtaining value from. And so everyone here and everyone working in this field needs to keep that in mind. How can you co-opt it a little bit? Because that's what it's going to be. It's academia co-opting things that are not done for academia, but can be of great benefit to academia, just like your gigabit fiber connection is of great benefit for doing research. That didn't come into existence because of you, but you can exploit it, you can make use of it. So that's what it's going to be in the next 10 to 20 years, is how can we pay attention to what these players who don't have our interests at heart, what they're doing, but you can retool it and re-steer it and make it be so that's what's going to happen, is they're going to completely dominate it for their own interests. And you can either watch that happen, or you can tweak it a little bit, put in this key little connector between what they did for that purpose and what you can do for something that you care about.
Yeah, that's good advice. And we definitely have a complex landscape to navigate here as users of open source tools and as people in academia. So yeah, we definitely have a lot of work to do still. Well, so first off, I want to thank everybody in our audience this morning for joining us. We really appreciate you hanging out with us for these couple hours. I really want to thank my team, the data services team, Bill, Jennifer, and Doris. Congratulations on a really awesome Geography Awareness Week. I really enjoyed the variety of topics that we covered, and those of us in the audience, I hope you did too. And then finally, huge, massive thanks to our panelists, Seth, Aisha, Tom, Jim. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing your perspectives. I hope that we can continue these conversations. So please stay in touch. And I hope everybody has a great weekend and a great Thanksgiving holiday coming up. So thank you very much.